This is the second video concerning the history of World War II, and today we'll be discussing the historical context of the Second World War by going back and reviewing the political landscape of Europe and abroad from the 19th century all the way up until the beginnings of World War I. This will be done to both see the rise of nationalism as an ideological force of prominence in Europe, and of course to see the beginnings and developments of states that would take part in World War II, those of both the Axis and the Allies. Now, it should be noted that this was a world of empires. Colonies were absolutely critical for the economic and political power of states. The aggressive grabbing of lands was not unique to the Axis powers and had been done by the Western forces for many, many generations. The most expansive empire by 1914, of course, was Great Britain. It held a mass array of colonies and daughter self-governing dominions, usually fomented by the displacement of peoples, resources, and native governments, and the bringing in of white settlers. This was done mostly through a vast array of military economic alliances with Britain, and of course through the Royal Navy, which held a tight stranglehold over the oceans. It was the greatest navy on earth at this point, of course. Now, the French controlled much of Western Africa and Indochina. The Dutch were in Indonesia. The Belgians held a vicious state up in the Congo, and even the Americans held the Philippines as an imperial holding. We shouldn't sugarcoat this. This is a world of democracies acting at the helm of empires. This is, of course, an example of industrially advanced nations exploiting the developing world. Here on the left, we see the vast British Empire in 1914. Again, that's the start of World War I, 1914. And on the right, we see the French Empire, also a very vast realm. A common justification or excuse for imperialism in this period was the white man's burden theory. This idea that Christian white men have this God-given role to both civilize and bring order to those they deemed barbarians of the world. One proponent was Cecil Rhodes, a famous British imperialist at the helm of the South Africa Company, the colonizer of Rhodesia. Western science was influenced by the book Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. And this brought about this idea in politics of social Darwinism, this notion that the races, that is the human races, are biologically locked in an unending war of supremacy. Of course, the whites would go to see that non-whites are potential political and social threats to the Western order. Now, Lothrop Stoddard's book, The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, he introduced another racist idea in the 1800s, that of the yellow peril. It's this fear of the Asian masses of the Orient. This idea that the numerous Asians acted as a threat to the Western order. There's a ton of these people. They're highly efficient, and they're just going to overrun the West. This idea was deeply rooted in the Western democratic powers, and it was seemingly confirmed by the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, in which the Japanese absolutely obliterated the Russian Navy and easily defeated them. This seemed to confirm in the eyes of many Europeans that the Asians were rising up against them in an ideological and racial struggle. Now, Germany prior to the First World War was a collection of, for a long time anyway, was a collection of states going all the way back to Napoleon Bonaparte's time. They were always a group of divided people who shared a common heritage and often a common language. In the latter half of the 1800s, they were united by Chancellor Otto von Bismarck and the Prussians. They managed to take Alsace-Lorraine from the French in the Franco-German War, which saw the beginnings of the German state as an imperial and political force to be reckoned with. Now, the Germans were, of course, a newcomer to the imperial scene. Their state itself had not been around that long. However, this idea of uniting all the German ethnic and social enclaves into a single state, this idea of the German people needing space to expand and grow their power, these ideas definitely predate Adolf Hitler and his notion of Lebensraum, or living space for the German people. These ideas do come early. They absolutely predate Hitler. Now, the form of government this German state took, they did have a monarchy, they did have a parliament, but they were politically inferior to those called the Junkers, which were the wealthy, elite landowning gentry. Now, Bismarck liked to operate with a well-tuned bureaucracy under these land-holding elite. He also developed social welfare programs to undermine his socialist opponents. Now, these socialists would not go away. Adolf Hitler and his Nazis would be the final political blow to the leftists in Germany. Now, Bismarck, he was not big on imperialism himself, but due to public pressure and from the Junkers, he did imperialize parts of Africa, various island holdings, and forced China to lease them the Jiaozhou Bay as a naval base in 1897, earning a 99-year lease. They did, of course, perform horrific violence against the Herero ethnic people of Namibia, and they did use concentration camps. Adolf Hitler was not the first to employ these either, although he would institutionalize them to a far greater extent. Now, on the right here, we can see that in the 1800s, the German peoples were very much divided before the Prussians helped unite them. So, of course, we see the beginnings of nationalism here. It's no surprise then that the goal of uniting all ethnic German enclaves separated by various foreign borders was an early idea. And one such organization that brought this about was the Pan-German League. These people that put this together were very much angry with the Treaty of Zanzibar, in which English and German possessions had traded hands in Africa and elsewhere, to which many Germans felt, that they had been dealt a bad card, and that the German people need to rise up and unite as a force to be reckoned with, not to be stepped on. Now, another goal here was to put an end to what the Germans deemed the Slavic flood, this idea that the Poles and Slavic peoples were separating the Germans and polluting their lands with their Eastern ideas and peoples. Now, the German Hohenzollern monarchy, therefore, was to colonize majority Polish zones and to expel Slavs into Russia. And again, this is just playing into the old medieval concept of the Drang nach Osten, this drive to the east, by which the Germans would force back these cultural and social invaders. Now we will be looking at the beginnings of the Japanese state that would predate World War I and World War II. Now, Japan was an isolationist power for much of its history, but was forced to open up to global, mostly American trade, due to Commodore Matthew Perry threatening to siege their harbor. He threatened them, and the Japanese, actually beforehand, of course, the Japanese had already decided to open up their trade, but in case they hadn't, the Americans were prepared to go to war over this. This is often referred to as gunboat diplomacy. Now, the state that the Japanese were accustomed to was their Tokugawa shogunate. It was this medieval political order whereby samurai lived under feudal obligations to the landowning gentry, the group referred to as the daimyo. However, China's failure to repel the West and, of course, their resultant imperialization scared the Japanese. They were not going to let themselves become imperialized as of course, the Chinese had. The Chinese had been chopped up into spheres of influence, whereby Western nations absolutely dominated their port cities. Now, what brought this about, of course, in Japan, this great political change, was the Meiji Restoration in 1867, whereby Emperor Meiji restored with practical powers. Now, there was, of course, an oligarchic government at play doing the real work, but the emperor was back for better or for worse. Now, to break the power of traditional landholding elite, what the Meiji government decided to do was to simply co-opt these daimyo as leaders and functionaries in the newly formed institutions, which of course were the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. Now, the chief tenets of the Meiji Restoration started with one, the estates of the daimyo being broken up and divided. The old elite, therefore, were repurposed into Imperial Japanese Army and Navy units. Now, the peasantry were emancipated into a capitalist, Western-style market economy, one which excelled in foreign trade and rapid industrialization. The army in this model answers to the emperor, not to parliament. Emperor and the oligarchs in this new government held inordinate power over domestic government policy. Now, the state was, much like Germany, new to the imperial scene, and seeing how American gunboat diplomacy influenced their perspective of international power and safety, the Japanese realized that they had to act as the Westerners did, violent and ready to seize on opportunities where they saw them. Now, the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 1895 saw China lose diplomatic power over Korea. They lost the nation of Taiwan, the Pescadores, which were islands, and the Liaodong Peninsula in Manchuria, which the Japanese referred to as Manchukuo. That, of course, was all culminated in the Treaty of Shimonoseki. The Chinese Qing dynasty were gradually being destabilized and weakened from all this foreign chaos, and they were already weakened from various internal systemic issues. And we will see that in World War II, their state completely falls and results in a power struggle between the nationalists and the Marxists. The Japanese also managed to absolutely defeat the Russian Navy in the War of 1904, and it's clear, of course, to the West that by 1914, Japan was the premier Asian nation. It wasn't even close. Japan was absolutely an imperialist, industrializing force by the beginnings of World War I, and would continue to do so all the way up until World War II. Now, much like Germany and much like the German states, I should say, Italy was a place very divided and had been for most of the Middle Ages. Now, Napoleon Bonaparte's redrawing of these Italian states was largely reversed by the Vienna settlement. Yet, these liberal French ideas of removing foreign Austro-Hungarian interference and a general disdain for the recently reinstated monarchies absolutely remained in the Italian ethos. Various Italian nationalist reform movements broke out, such as the Carbonari movement in 1820, which, of course, like many other sequential reform movements, was promptly crushed by Austrian troops. There were numerous other movements that went on for about 3 decades, and most of them failed. However, one revolutionary really galvanized what would become the Italian unification movement, and that man was Giuseppe Mazzini. He led, of course, the Young Italy organization. He was a radical reformer. He was for a republican government and a generally unified Italy. Now, the nationalists, generally speaking, were very divided. The 1840s was a bad year for them. There was a ton of war, particularly in 1848. And after following years of constant, seemingly unending war, we actually see that much of southern Italy gradually unites with the powerful Kingdom of Piedmont up north. And in 1867, the Kingdom of Italy was founded, with King Victor Emmanuel II as its king. Now, the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, and again, I spoke of this earlier, this was the war that united much of Germany and brought about the beginnings of the German state. What we see is that the French Emperor Napoleon III ends up abdicating, and of course the French troops then, allied with the Papal States, leave the city of Rome, which the Italians then claimed as their new capital. So, as we've seen, the Japanese, German, and Italian states went under rapid social and governmental change in this period. That is the period preceding the First World War, and the Western powers were largely at the helms, despite being democracies, of very large empires. Now, what we see is that there is, in this period, leading into the 1900s, rapid industrialization, rapid arms races, and rapid competition for power in the grand imperialist scheme of international world domination. This is the backdrop to World War I, and when we meet next, we will discuss the beginnings of World War I, the effects it has on Europe, and particularly the effect the Versailles settlement has on the German political identity.